Hello, this is John Wyatt. It's a great privilege for me to be able to give this talk on ethical dilemmas at the Evangelical Forum gathering in Prague. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person. And in this talk I'm going to try to engage in what John Stott called double listening. We have to listen to the world in the light of the Bible, and we have to listen to the Bible in the light of the world. So I'm going to be focusing on ethical issues relating to advancing technology, especially in healthcare and medicine. What are the deep themes that underline recent developments and ethical challenges? And how does a Christian understanding of what it means to be human provide valuable and practical ways of responding? What kind of world is technology creating for our children? And how can we relate the unchanging and ancient truths of the Christian faith to the strange and confusing possibilities that technology offers for the world? First, I'd like to say a little bit about my own medical background. I spent most of my life and professional career as a paediatrician, a neonatologist, working at a major referral centre in central London. Most of the infants I cared for were born extremely preterm, some as little as 22 or 23 weeks of gestation, weighing 500 grams or less. The only chance of survival, for instance, such as these, is through the application of sophisticated medical technology. And in the UK, everything was paid for by the government through the National Health Service. So presumably as a society, we've decided that these tiny and vulnerable lives are valuable, special and unique. And yet just one floor away in the fetal medicine unit, this was another highly sophisticated and technologically advanced facility where pregnant mothers undergo detailed imaging and diagnostic procedures to try and identify abnormalities in the unborn baby. And when significant genetic or other abnormalities are detected, sometimes late abortions, called feticides, are carried out in my hospital, sometimes at gestational ages of 24, 28, 30 or even greater weeks of gestation. And as a paediatrician, I was frequently called from the neonatal unit to discuss the outlook for an unborn baby with a pregnant mother who was considering the medical destruction of her baby, even though her baby was considerably bigger and stronger than many of the babies we were struggling to save just one floor above. How is it possible for one hospital and one medical system to support these activities which seem to be mutually incompatible? So it is my practical experience as a physician facing this kind of complex ethical challenges which drove me to engage in the world of medical ethics. I had the great privilege to become a close friend of John Stott, and he became a kind of spiritual father to me, as he was to many people. It was his example of modelling, double listening, and thoughtful, compassionate dialogue and engagement with secular leaders and thinkers, which provided for me a powerful vision and example. So this is a deeply confused and confusing world in which God has called us to serve him. And we see many challenges both at the beginning and the end of life. When it comes to abortion, we see increasing use of abortion across the world, both illegal and legalized abortion. And what's happened in many countries, including here in the UK, is that abortion starts off as something that is only available in extreme circumstances, an argument based on compassion, but then it becomes something that's an option for any woman who requests it, and an argument based on female emancipation or liberation. But increasingly we're seeing a new argument, and that is based on a social duty. It's your duty to have an abortion. Why would you bring an unwanted baby into the world? Why would you bring a baby who might have genetic or other problems? At the other end of life, we've seen the spread of euthanasia and assisted suicide across the world. And I'm afraid to say that just as we speak, a bill to legalise a form of assisted suicide is being debated in Parliament. It's passed through the early stages, and I'm afraid there's a very significant risk that assisted suicide will be legalised here in the UK. And as we look across the world, we can see a kind of plague of medical killing, which is spreading out from the richer Western countries, but which I'm afraid is likely to spread to many other countries across the world. So these issues about the destruction of human life, particularly abortion and euthanasia, have been around for many centuries. In fact, the early Christian church wrestled with these ethical dilemmas, and 2,000 years later, they are still here. They're still a major problem. But what is happening is that at the same time as these old issues about the destruction of human life, there are new ethical issues about the creation of human life, the making, the shaping, the manipulation of human life, and even the faking of human life. So this is issues like reproductive technology, advances in intensive care, smart drugs, enhancement technology, merging between humans and machines, and rapidly advancing artificial intelligence and robotics. And I believe these are some very complex and genuinely new issues which are facing us, and which God is calling us to engage as people of His people who are faithful to the revelation of Scripture and faithful to the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm just very rapidly going to mention some of the new challenges which I see. There are many more that I could mention, but here's just a selection to show you the kind of challenges that are coming down the line. One is the creation of what are called synthetic embryos. It's possible by using stem cells taken from embryos to combine them together and create a kind of weird being in the laboratory, which is a kind of synthetic embryo created out of different forms of stem cells. And it's been suggested that it'll be able to develop these beings in the lab, and there are strange things called cerebral organoids, tissue made out of cerebral stem cells which are being grown in the lab. Another concept which I think is increasingly important is that of transhumanism. The idea that we're going to use sophisticated technology to try and enhance our humanity above and beyond what is part of our normal existence. And in fact, I think we can already see what I would call a low-tech kind of transhumanism, of human enhancement, which is already taking place in many places across the world. And one is the rapid spread of cosmetic surgery. This is a kind of low-tech transhumanism. I don't have to accept the body that I've been given, the body that God has given me. I'm going to use surgery to change my face, to change my body, my breasts, my what other organs, whatever it is, to make it more acceptable, to make my body match with how I want it to be. Similar things are happening with in the area of bodybuilding and body enhancement using steroids or other sophisticated kind of chemicals, again designed to enhance and strengthen my body beyond what would be a normal form of existence. The idea of cognitive enhancement, so I can use drugs to try and increase my intellectual ability, my intelligence. So there are various kind of drugs which are being widely used now, apparently in some universities and by students, as a way of increasing cognitive ability. There are even drugs which have been suggested could be used to suppress memories, so that if I've been exposed to some extremely traumatic incident, there are drugs which would, if I take them immediately, would suppress painful memories. So the idea is that I'll be able to manipulate my thinking processes, my memories, my emotions, as I choose. And then the idea of life extension. So it's becoming apparent that particularly in America, there are a lot of very rich and very scared older men who are terrified of death. They've gone through their life spending a great deal of money to and deal with whatever problems they have, and now they want to spend their money to deal with the problem of death. And you could name a whole number of billionaires who are investing very serious money in recruiting scientific research teams to try to push back death, to try and increase life extension. Google, Amazon, many other billionaires are involved in trying to use technology to enhance and extend life. Maybe it's possible to live for 150 years, maybe for 200 years, maybe longer. We have the technology. We're going to make it happen. And of course, we're also seeing very rapid advances in robots and in AI. And I haven't time to talk about all the new developments and the challenges which are coming there. But again, just to point out that this is part of the idea of replacing, even faking normal human companionship. There aren't enough human carers, so maybe we can create humanoid robots. Or maybe AI will be able to develop simulated companions who will always be there for us, who will always be friendly and compassionate and supportive, and they'll know us better than we know ourselves. In fact, Elon Musk has argued that because of these rapid advances in artificial intelligence, we as a species are about to be completely overwhelmed, and the only chance for us to survive is we have to merge with the machines. We have to make connections between the human brain and artificial intelligence, and that this is going to be the way that we're going to be able to survive as a species. And Elon Musk has created a company called Neuralink, and they're already starting to see some successes in developing a way of connecting the human brain to computer technology. It's not just Elon Musk. In fact, a whole number of military research units around the world, including the US military and the UK military, China, Russia, are all involved in trying to find ways of connecting the human brain to machines so that we can have a new generation of smart soldiers. And all this seems to be creating a bizarre world in which increasingly advanced forms of artificial intelligence and simulation are going to become more and more sophisticated, so much so that it may become to the point where we can't really tell the difference between what is human and what is artificial. It's already the case with chatbots that sometimes it's impossible to tell whether we're really talking to a real human being or whether this is a very sophisticated artificial creation. And so this is an extraordinarily confused and confusing world that we live in, and how can we engage as followers of Christ in this world in which He's called us to live? I mean, we must always remember that it's not just these philosophical and theoretical issues, because so many of the issues that I've just mentioned are actually dominated by fear, by human beings who suffer and agonize and worry. And therefore, we should never reduce our ethics just to cold theology or unfeeling abstract moral principles. As followers of Christ, our first duty is to empathize, to enter into the pain of those who suffer. Because Jesus demonstrated to us in the cross the way of empathy, that Jesus entered into the experience of humanity He experienced it from the inside, and we're called to engage with empathy. So I want to highlight 4 themes which I think are really important. What we're called to do is to try to build a bridge between the world of the Christian faith and this deeply confusing and challenging world in which God has placed us. And in order to do that, we need to be engaged on both sides of this gulf. It seems like there's a great gulf between the world of the Bible and the world, the modern technological world I've just outlined. Is it possible to create a link between these two realities? But I believe by God's grace, absolutely it is possible, but we need to dig deep on both sides, both on the biblical Christian side, but also in the technical and secular world in which God has placed us. And in order to create deep foundations on both sides of the divide, and then we can create a bridge, we can find a way of how to link. And so, as part of that digging deeper, I want to try and suggest 4 ways of thinking which are increasingly common in the secular world. This is part of double listening, trying to understand and listen carefully. John Stott said, if we want to engage with the non-Christian world, we have to be prepared to listen and to understand before we speak. So I want to try and outline 4 moral assumptions which are increasingly common for 21st century people. Now, I'm aware that this is particularly happening in the Western Anglo-Saxon world, particularly in the States, here in the UK. But I think these modern ideas are very, very powerful. I regard them as almost like acids, and they penetrate and spread throughout society. So I suspect where you are in Eastern Europe, these ideas will become increasingly relevant, and I'm sure you're already starting to see some of these ideas becoming more current within the secular world. So the first is the principle of autonomy, and I define the meaning and direction of my life. On the surface it seems so simple, doesn't it? Human beings have the right to choose, and if we can control every other aspect of our life, such as where we live and how we spend our money and how we spend our time, then why on earth cannot we choose whether to create a baby, or whether to destroy our own unborn baby, or whether to choose to kill ourselves? So philosophers call this the principle of autonomy, meaning self-rule, or more crudely, I make my own laws. And autonomy is an important principle. It's an especially important principle in healthcare. It's the patient who should be at the centre, choosing and controlling what treatments are given. But behind this is the concept of liberal individualism. I create the meaning and the purpose of my own life. So that's the first principle, the principle of autonomy. The second principle is often called moral relativism. So this is the second secular principle we find. And this says, I define what right and wrong means, what good and evil means. A biblical understanding of morality, and indeed that of all traditional religions and worldviews, is that good and evil, right and wrong, are external to ourselves. In other words, as we grow up as individuals, we discover the meaning of right and wrong, good and evil. Morality is objective. It's part of the way the world is. This view is often described as moral realism. But in modern secular thinking, there's a growing belief that this is just a myth. Instead, it is argued, morality is just a game invented by our clever human minds in order to increase our chances of survival. This way of thinking has a variety of philosophical names, such as moral subjectivism, emotivism, or moral relativism. But the idea is that we just pretend that certain actions are good and other actions are evil. It's just a social game. It's a matter of personal, cultural, social preferences. Of course, in reality, our secular societies are deeply confused about good and evil, about right and wrong. There are some kinds of action that most people view as objectively evil, like sexual and physical abuse of children, for example, or genocide or war crimes. But in other areas of morality, like abortion or euthanasia, well then, moral relativism rules. How dare you say to me that what I'm freely choosing to do is wrong? Then the third theme is that suffering is meaningless and dehumanizing. Our modern society is losing the belief that suffering, hardship and struggle can have any positive value or meaning. In fact, these things are seen as dehumanizing. They threaten the very meaning and the dignity of my life. So our most important goal should be to find ways of eliminating all suffering and hardship from our lives. And so this is the techno-optimist vision, a vision of a future in which advanced technologies enable every aspect of life to become frictionless. Every desire, every longing, every interest is going to be satisfied instantly, effortlessly. Frustration, struggle and boredom is going to be banished from everyday experience, and so we'll be free to exercise our choices and fulfill our dreams with the minimum of effort. It's worth noticing how important this is in the current debates about death and dying. The most important goal is to stop any form of suffering. The ideal death is one of euthanasia, quick, painless, anxiety-free. And then finally, the fourth theme, whatever the problems are, technology can solve them and build a better world. So here, medical and biotechnology are seen as capable of providing practical fixes for deeply complex human problems. And the natural response of modern people is to say, whatever the problem is, there must be a technological fix. So here are the four moral themes of contemporary society. 1, I define the meaning and the direction of my own life. 2, I define what's right and wrong, what is good and evil. 3, suffering and hardship, struggle, they're all meaningless, they're all dehumanizing. And finally, whatever the problems are, technology can solve them and build a better world. So now we need to turn from listening and trying to understand the questions that the world is asking. We need to now turn to the Christian world, to the Bible. And we're listening to the Bible in the light of the world. So biblical Christians are moral realists. And biblical ethics, the way we're called to treat one another, comes from biblical anthropology. So let's look very briefly at 3 headlines of biblical anthropology. First of all, we're made in God's image, each one of us. Each human life is not only a gift from God, it's actually a reflection of his character and being. Human beings are godlike beings. And so in Christian thinking, human beings are not self-explanatory. No, we derive our meaning from outside ourselves, from the very being of God himself. So the significance, the value of every human life comes not from our function or from our abilities, but from the very stuff of our being, from the way that God has called us into existence. Each human life is like a masterpiece of unique and irreplaceable value. And that's why to destroy a human life is not only a terrible evil perpetrated on that individual and on society, it is in a sense to spit in the face of God himself, to violate everything that the image of God represents. But second, we're made out of dust. Sorry, before I want to move on, I just want to say that the incarnation, when God enters into human existence as a recognizable human being, as a real human baby, he vindicates and values what it means to be human. And when he is raised from the dead as a recognizable, touchable human being, it's like God's final vote of confidence in human structure. Human lives matter because this is the form in which God became flesh. So human lives are precious, and yet we're taught that we're made out of dust. And that means we're made out of the same stuff as everything else. The Hebrew word for human, Adam, is derived from the word for ground, Adamah. We are created in solidarity with the rest of the physical universe, and we share the limitations of the physical universe. In fact, we can go further. We can say that God designed us to be physical, dependent, frail, and vulnerable human beings. Dependence is not an alien, subhuman kind of undignified condition. You and I came into the world utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of people we did not choose. And then we go through a phase of our lives when other people depend on us. We protect them, care for them, feed them, pay for them. But you know, most of us will end our physical lives totally and utterly dependent on the love and care of others. We will need other people to feed us, protect us, and care for us. And from a Christian perspective, this is not a terrible, degrading, inhuman reality. Dependence is part of the story, part of the narrative of the human lives that God had been given us. And from the perspective of the Christian faith, even God, in the person of Jesus, experiences the complete dependence on other beings that being human entails. So note that frailty and weakness and dependence are not a consequence of the fall, of the entry of evil into the world. No, although they may be exacerbated and contaminated by evil, in fact, dependence and weakness derives from creation. They're part of the narrative of every human life. And then third, we're made into families. Every human being on the planet is created as part of a single human family. I was not born as an isolated individual. I came into the world locked into a network of relations, of people I didn't choose, with a mother and a father and grandparents, siblings, aunts and uncles, friends and carers. So despite our superficial differences, all of us are deeply related and we share a common humanity. And every person that I'm talking to now is a distant relative. And that's why we're called to treat even the stranger and the immigrants with gentleness, with respect and with love, because we are a family. In any family, the strong have a duty to protect and care for the weak. In 1918, a boy named Howard Loomis was abandoned by his mother at a Catholic home for boys. Howard had polio and wore heavy leg braces. Walking was difficult for him, so several of Howard's older boys used to carry Howard about, especially up and down stairs. And one day, the founder of the home asked an older boy if carrying Howard was hard. And his reply was, "He ain't heavy, father. He's my brother." The words were made famous in a 1980s pop song released by the Hollies. But I think they encapsulate a profound truth about being human. To be called into a family is to be called to share the burdens of the life which God has given us, the burdens which come from our creation out of dust. It's not possible for me in this short talk to address many of the complex ethical issues about embryos and reproductive technology and so on. However, it seems to me that as Christian people, we're called to protect human life at every stage of its development, from the earliest stages of embryonic life through to death through natural processes. We don't have any right to introduce death into the womb. through abortion, and we have no right to introduce death at the end of life through euthanasia or assisted suicide. Intentional killing of innocent human beings is not consistent with Christ-like compassion. But this does not mean that we have a duty to prolong life as long as possible and in all circumstances. There is a time to say enough is enough, to withhold or withdraw medical invasive treatments and allow death to occur naturally. This is the fundamental insight which lies behind the development of modern palliative care, which started in the UK with the Christian physician Cicely Saunders. The philosophy of palliative care is to neither to hasten death intentionally nor to try to hold death away. Instead, we are called to allow death to occur naturally at its own timing while we focus on maximizing the quality of life of the dying person. So how do we respond practically as Christian believers in a society which is increasingly moving away from a Christian understanding? Well, we have a responsibility to act as salt and light, to act as a preservative and a disinfectant, penetrating into all areas of society, opposing corruption and evil, minimizing harm, shining truth and light into areas which others wish to keep dark and concealed. And second, we have a duty, although we have a duty to uphold a biblical understanding of the value of human life, it seems to me that we must engage with secular people in an empathic and positive way. We have to recognize the pain and the fear which drive people to abortion or euthanasia. In the UK and the USA, I'm afraid so often the Christian voice in public seems negative, uncaring, and judgmental. It's like a voice saying, this is evil, it's against God's will, doctors have become murderers, we're calling down judgment on our society, and so on. But you know, whenever we, as Christian people, we say that something is wrong, we must immediately go on and say, and here is a better way. So what are some of these better ways? Well, for the problem of the unplanned or crisis pregnancy, I want to commend the role of Christian pregnancy centres. I've been the trustee of a centre in London for many years, and my wife was the director of that centre. These Christian centres provide a safe space and supportive counselling for women and their partners. The centres also provide practical support and baby equipment for single, unsupported mothers who continue the pregnancy. They provide counselling for women and men who are emotionally traumatised by a previous abortion. So other practical steps we can take is to encourage Christians to offer themselves as adoptive parents to abandoned or disabled children, developing Christian communities as centres of caring for the most vulnerable in society, encouraging Christian health professionals, research scientists and lay carers, fighting for improved support for families affected by genetic or congenital conditions. At the end of life, we can be encouraging and supporting palliative care and the work of hospices, argue in favour of improving the quality and the availability of end-of-life care, and educating and supporting Christian believers on what it means to die well. And finally, we need to oppose the simplistic belief that all suffering and hardship is meaningless. God's plan for this age is not to abolish suffering, but it's to redeem it. It's to bring strange and unexpected blessing and healing out of suffering and pain. And our calling as followers of Christ is to be there with those who suffer. I love this quote, which I've used many times. Suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence. What about the new technology and the challenges which are coming over the horizon? Well, I'm convinced that the Christian understanding of what it means to be human has a new relevance in the coming age. Many people in our society have deep intuitions that the direction in which digital technologies are taking us is not healthy. They sense that a future of enhanced and manipulated human bodies, of brains connected to computers, of frictionless worlds in which we can fulfill all our dreams, this doesn't seem to be a future in which ordinary human beings can flourish. Yet so often secular philosophies cannot give a convincing rational reason for opposing these developments. In contrast, I am convinced that the historic biblical Christian faith does give convincing and persuasive reasons for upholding and protecting our current so-called unmodified human condition. We see this in the doctrine of creation. The uniqueness of human beings created in God's image, created out of dust, frail and vulnerable, independent. Our creation as physical and embodied beings tells us that a digital, effortless, frictionless future is not one in which human beings will be able to flourish. From the earliest days, every child discovers that reality does not always behave as I want it to. Reality pushes back at us. We experience hunger and thirst and pain and discomfort, and all these unpleasant experiences are crucial to our formation. We discover the satisfaction of overcoming hurdles, of learning to walk, to run, to speak, to read, to study, to cook a meal, to ride a bike. We develop resilience and character as we overcome obstacles. So it seems that actually struggle and resistance and suffering and cultivating discipline in the face of difficulties, these are precisely the routes by which we learn and grow and flourish as created and embodied human beings. And the Christian reasons for preserving and protecting our current human condition is seen most of all in the doctrines of the incarnation and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. When Christ is born as an utterly dependent and vulnerable embodied human being, we see that his divine status and dignity as the second person of the Godhead is in no way damaged. And when Christ is raised as a physical, touchable and recognizable human being, as we've said, it's God's final yes to original model humanity. In Jesus, the second Adam, we see both a perfect human being, what the original Adam was intended to be, and also the pioneer, the blueprint for a new type of human being, the one in whose likeness a new creation will spring, the first fruits of those who are to come. So it seems to me we can use technology in the natural world with restraint and with wisdom in order to feed the hungry, shelter the vulnerable, provide medical care for the sick. But when it comes to using technology to change our own human nature, it seems to me we're crossing a boundary. However limited and restricted our current human bodies are, I think as Christians we can say we don't need to create a better, stronger, brighter kind of humanity. If this kind of original model humanity was good enough for Jesus, then it's good enough for us too. In that well-known passage in Matthew 5, Jesus told his disciples that they were to act as salt and light in the world. And these metaphors are valuable as we consider how evangelicals, as a small minority within society, can nonetheless, by God's grace and through the working of the Holy Spirit, influence the development of society as a whole. Because you only need a tiny amount of salt to act as a preservative, to counteract and oppose the hidden processes of decay. John Stott wrote that although God has set other restraining influences in the community through his common grace, nevertheless he intends the most powerful of all restraints to be his own redeemed and regenerate and righteous people acting as salt. In order to penetrate the world of technology, we need followers of Christ who have the professional expertise and training to understand and engage the technical issues. So our goal is not to oppose technology in a mindless way, it is to redeem technology through God's grace, to transform it from its potential for evil into alignment with God's purposes. We need to encourage younger Christians to enter into the worlds of science and technology, into the regulatory authorities, in order to exert an influence for good. But to be effective, Christians must retain their Christ-likeness. If we become indistinguishable from the rest of the world, we lose our saltiness, our preservative influence. And in the role of light, we're called to penetrate into dark places. Light reveals truths which powerful people want to keep hidden. Being light means standing up for the vulnerable, being a voice for the voiceless, and a defender of the defenseless. As John Stott put it, the Lord Jesus called us to be the world's salt and light. If darkness and rottenness abound, it is largely our fault, and we must accept the blame. In order to be an influence for Christ, we need to engage in dialogue with those who disagree with us, listening carefully to their arguments and concerns, treating those who oppose us with respect. As John Stott put it, we have no liberty to impose our views and opinions on other people, but in a democratic and open society, we have the precious freedom to seek to persuade people, to marshal arguments in favour of Christian thinking and Christian behaviour. And so I'm coming to the end. As we saw earlier, our culture thinks of everything as a form of making and construction. The future is created out of the present by human choices and actions. It's constructed brick by brick as each of us make choices here and now. But an alternative Christian understanding is to see that the entire history of the world is encompassed within the plans and providential purposes of God. It is as though there is a great river of history which is flowing through the cosmos. We didn't create this river, nor can we direct its course or its ultimate destination. Instead, as we undertake an action, we launch it into the great river of history. What happens to it after that is out of our control. Certainly our actions may have long-term consequences and repercussions downstream, but as human beings we cannot control these. Human freedom is always expressed within the wider context of God's providence, his wise and beneficent rule and ordering of the river of history. So we are called to employ our technology with wisdom, with care, with restraint, aware of the possible downstream consequences of our actions. But we submit to the wider horizon, this great river of God's providence. We cannot take on false responsibility for fashioning and creating the future. Redeemed technology has a part to play in the journey to the new heaven and the new earth, but in the end we recognise that the future is not ours to fashion or construct, and humanity is not ours to mould. The future lies secure in the providential purposes which God has for the natural order, and in our embodied humanity, which is both vindicated and celebrated in the person of the risen Christ. And as the Lord Jesus encouraged us time and again, don't be afraid. Thanks so much for listening to this talk. There's more material available on my website, johnwyatt.com, and also there's a weekly podcast called Matters of Life and Death, which you can find on any podcast provider. May God bless you.